Hello, Pack. The smoke came over the ridge at Sable before the sound did. She had been walking since before light, 3 days of wet boots and the particular quiet of the high pine country after autumn storms, and she was 12 miles from the border settlement at Ashgate with a medical kit that needed to be there by nightfall. She turned toward the smoke anyway. 6 pups from the Ironhold pack were in the trees ahead. The alpha king of a territory she had never set foot in was 2 hours behind her on the same road. She knew neither of these things. She only knew the smell. Let's begin. The fire had started in the eastern stand, where the pines grew oldest and closest together. By the time Sable saw the orange line through the trees, it was already moving fast, pushed by the kind of wind that arrives in autumn like it has somewhere important to be. She stopped walking, stood still for exactly 3 seconds. She counted them without meaning to, a habit she'd had since childhood. And then she dropped her medical kit at the base of a white boulder that would be easy to find again. She ran toward the fire. She wasn't a wolf. She had no enhanced senses, no shifted form, no pack bond to tell her where the danger was concentrated. What she had was a healer's training, a precise knowledge of how smoke moved through confined spaces, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent 15 years traveling alone between packs and had learned that waiting for someone else to act was a decision in itself. She heard them before she saw them. Not howling. Too young for that. A high, thin sound, almost below hearing, the kind of distress call that pups make when they haven't yet learned that making noise draws predators. She followed it into the smoke. The den was a shallow depression beneath the roots of a fallen pine, just deep enough to shelter 6 small bodies. They were pressed together in the back corner, the eldest no more than 8 weeks old, their eyes still carrying the clouded blue of early youth. The smoke was already thick at ground level. Another 4 minutes and it wouldn't have mattered. Sable pulled her traveling cloak off her shoulders and spread it on the ground. She worked methodically, the way her father had taught her. Assess, prioritize, act. She checked each pup for injury before she moved it, running her hands along small spines and ribs in the smoke and the orange half-light. 2 had singed fur on their haunches. 1 had a shallow cut from the root debris. The others were frightened but whole. She wrapped them in the cloak, 6 bodies bundled against her chest and tucked under her arms, and she walked back out through the smoke. The fire was closer when she emerged. The wind had shifted, and the eastern stand was now fully involved, a wall of orange and black that made the air shimmer and the pine needles on the ground curl. She moved north, away from it, counting her steps without meaning to, watching the tree line for the gap she'd come through. The first tree fell behind her at 43 steps. She didn't look back. She made it to the clearing at the forest's edge as the second tree came down, and she set the bundle of pups on the frost-hard ground and opened the cloak to count them. 6. All breathing. The cut on the third one's shoulder was bleeding more freely now, and she pressed 2 fingers against it and held them there, kneeling in the frost, watching the fire take the stand of pines she'd walked out of. The pups were making noise now. Properly, loudly, the kind of sound that carries. She heard the horses before she saw them. There were 6 riders. They came from the south road, moving fast, and they pulled up at the clearing's edge with the particular controlled urgency of people who had been riding hard and were trained not to show it. The horses were dark, well-bred, and carrying more weight than pleasure mounts. The riders wore the gray and iron of Ironhold. The man at the front was not wearing armor. He was wearing a riding coat the color of charcoal, and he sat his horse the way certain men sit in the chairs at the heads of very long tables, as if the space had been organized around him rather than the other way around. He saw the fire first, then the clearing, then the bundle on the ground, and the woman kneeling beside it. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. He was tall, Sable registered this the way she registered most things, as information, filed and held. He moved across the frost-hard ground with a speed that was not quite human and stopped 3 feet from her, and she looked up from the pup she was treating and met his eyes. Gray. The particular gray of river ice in early winter. Not cold exactly, but the kind of color that had been cold for a long time. He looked at the pups. He looked at her hands, 2 fingers still pressed against the small wound. He looked at the fire behind her, and something moved in his expression that she couldn't name. "How many?" he said. "6," she said, "all alive. 2 with minor burns, 1 with a shoulder laceration that needs proper cleaning. The others are frightened but uninjured." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had weight to it. "The den is gone," she said, because it seemed like information he needed. "The eastern stand is fully involved. I don't know how long they were in there before I found them, but the smoke was already at ground level when I reached them." One of the riders behind him said something low in the pack dialect she didn't fully know. The man in the charcoal coat didn't respond. He crouched down in front of her. Not beside her, in front of her, which put them at eye level, which she suspected was a deliberate choice. He looked at the pups for a long moment, and then he looked at her. "You're not pack," he said. "No." "You're not from Ironhold territory." "No, I'm a traveling healer. My kit is at the base of a white boulder about a quarter-mile east. I'd like to retrieve it before someone else does." Something shifted in his expression. Not much. Just a fraction. He stood. He said something to the nearest rider in pack dialect, and the rider turned his horse and went east at a canter. Then he looked back down at her. "The pups belong to Ironhold," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not keeping them." The silence stretched. "I'm Calum," he said. "Alpha King of Ironhold." She looked at him steadily. "Sable, traveling healer, currently treating a shoulder laceration in the frost, which I'd rather not do longer than necessary." He studied her for another moment. Then he said, "Come to the keep. You can treat them properly there." It wasn't quite an invitation. It wasn't quite an order. It occupied the space between them like a door left open in cold weather. "All right," she said. Ironhold Keep was 3 miles from the clearing, and it rose from the high pine country like something that had grown there rather than been built. Stone walls the color of old iron, towers that caught the early dawn light and held it without warmth. The gates were already open when they arrived, which meant someone had ridden ahead, and the courtyard was occupied by the kind of organized activity that suggested the fire had been reported and the response was already underway. Sable rode pillion behind one of the outriders. The bundle of pups redistributed between 2 riders with more practice at carrying small animals than she'd expected. The Alpha King rode ahead, and she watched his back and the set of his shoulders for the 3 miles and filed away what she saw. He didn't speak to her on the ride. He spoke to his riders in low exchanges she couldn't follow, and twice he turned his horse to look back at the fire's glow above the tree line, and each time he turned back, his jaw was set in a way that suggested the calculation happening behind his eyes was not finished. The courtyard at Ironhold was stone, swept clean, with iron torch brackets along the walls that had been lit despite the dawn light. When they rode in, the wolves came. Not riders. Wolves. The pack shifted members, moving through the courtyard from the inner gates, and they stopped when they reached the group. Stopped and stood very still, and then, one by one, they lowered their heads. Not at Calum? Sable felt the moment land in her chest, like something falling from a height. She was still on the horse, still holding the edge of the saddle, and the wolves were bowing in a ripple that moved outward from the gate, and she had no explanation for it that made sense. She looked at the Alpha King. He had turned his horse and was watching her. His expression was the stillness of something that had finally stopped bracing. She filed it away without knowing why. They gave her a workroom off the main hall, stone-floored with a long table and good lamp oil, and she spent the first 2 hours treating the pups, while a young pack member named Dara hovered near the door and handed her things when she asked for them. The burns on the 2 elder pups were superficial. She cleaned them, applied the salve from her kit, and wrapped the worst with clean linen. The shoulder laceration needed 4 small stitches, which the pup bore with a stoicism that she found unreasonably impressive for something that weighed less than 4 pounds. Caleb came once, briefly, while she was finishing the stitches. He stood in the doorway and looked at the pups arranged on the padded section of the table, small, clean, sleeping in a pile, and then he looked at her hands. "They'll need feeding soon," she said without looking up. "I don't know if you have a nursing female available, but goat's milk warmed to body temperature will work for the next day or 2 if not." "We have a nursing female," he said. "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before." "Treating burns or treating pups?" "Both." "Yes," she said. She tied off the last stitch and set down her needle. "The burns will need checking in 3 days, the stitches in 5. I can do it before I go, or I can leave instructions if you have a pack healer." "Our pack healer is in the southern settlement," he said. "She won't be back for a week." Sable looked at the pups. She looked at her kit, which had been returned to her, intact, by the rider who'd gone east. She thought about the road to Ashgate, which was still washed out. "I can stay 3 days," she said. "After that, the stitches should be holding well enough that your healer can manage the rest." He said, 3 days, the way a man repeats something he's deciding whether to believe. "Unless the road south clears sooner," she said, "in which case 2. Something in his expression shifted again. That fraction. She was beginning to catalog the variations. "Dara will show you to a room," he said. He left. She looked at the pups for a moment. They were sleeping in a pile, small and warm and alive, and the fire's glow was gone from the window. The sky outside was fully light now, pale gold and cold. She counted the stitches. 6. On the second day, she found the library. It was on the 3rd floor of the keep's east wing, accessible through a corridor that smelled of old stone and lamp oil, and it contained the kind of collection that suggested someone had spent a long time acquiring things they didn't want to talk about: medical texts, border treaties, pack law manuscripts in 3 different dialects, genealogical records going back 6 generations. She was standing in front of the genealogy shelves, with her head tilted sideways when Caleb found her. "The pups are well," she said before he could speak. "I checked them an hour ago. The burns are clean. The stitches are holding." "I know," he said. "Dara told me." He stood in the doorway the way he'd stood in the workroom doorway, filling the space without crowding it, which she was beginning to understand was a particular skill of his. "You have a complete copy of the Ironhold Valdrin Border Accords," she said. "I've been looking for one for 2 years. "Why?" "I'm a traveling healer. Border Accords determine which packs I can cross into without an escort. The Ironhold Valdrin boundary has been disputed for a decade, which means I've been taking a 40-mile detour around it every time I go north." He was quiet for a moment. "You travel alone." "Yes." "Through disputed territory. The 40-mile detour avoids the disputed section. That's the point of knowing where the dispute is." He came into the library. He moved to the shelf she was looking at and pulled a volume without hesitation. Muscle memory, the kind that comes from handling something often. He held it out to her. "You can read it here," he said, "or take it with you when you go, if you return it through the Ashgate settlement." She took the volume. Their hands didn't touch. She noted that he'd been careful about that. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and left. She stood in the library with the border accords in her hands and looked at the space where he'd been standing. And she thought about the way he'd known exactly which volume to reach for without looking, and she filed it away with the other things she was filing. On the second night, she couldn't sleep. The keep was quiet in the way that large stone buildings are quiet. Not silent, but full of the particular sounds of structure. The settling of walls, the movement of wind through arrow slits, the distant low sound of wolves somewhere in the outer yard. She had been lying in the bed they'd given her for an hour before she gave up, and pulled on her boots and her traveling coat, and went out into the corridor. She walked without a destination, which was how she usually thought through problems. The corridor on the second floor ran east-west, with arrow-slit windows on the north side that looked out over the inner yard. She stopped at one and looked out. Callum was in the yard. He was alone, and he was not doing anything in particular. Standing near the iron torch bracket at the yard's center, looking at something in the middle distance that she couldn't see from her angle. He was in shirt sleeves despite the cold, which she noted as information and set aside. His hands were at his sides, open, not fists, not clasped. Just open, the way hands look when the person they belong to has stopped performing ease and is simply standing. She watched him for a moment. He turned and looked directly at her window. She didn't move. The arrow slit was narrow and the corridor behind her was dark, and there was no reason he should have been able to see her. But he looked at the window with the particular precision of someone who knows exactly where to look, and he held it for 3 seconds. She counted, and then he looked away. She went back to her room. She lay in the dark and thought about gray eyes and open hands and the way he'd reached for that border accord without looking. And she thought about the wolves bowing in the courtyard, and she thought about the 3 seconds in the arrow slit, and she did not sleep for a long time. On the morning of the 3rd day, the council came. There were 4 of them, 3 elders, and a woman Sable's age with a smooth voice and careful hands who was introduced as Counselor Veth. They arrived at the workroom while Sable was checking the Pups' burns. Doing the work, which she'd noticed was the thing that made most people either dismiss her or underestimate her, and she'd long since stopped caring which. "The healer," Counselor Veth said, not a greeting, an identification. "The Pups," Sable said, in the same tone, and didn't look up. One of the elders cleared his throat. "We understand you've been given access to the Keep's library." "The Alpha King offered it." "Yes." Veth's voice was smooth, precisely enunciated, the kind of careful that had been practiced. "We're also aware that you were present in the courtyard yesterday morning when the pack responded to your arrival." Sable finished checking the last Pup's burn and set it down gently. Then she turned and looked at the council. "I noticed that," she said. "It's unusual," Veth said, "for a non-pack member to receive that kind of response." "I imagine it is. We'd like to understand why it happened." Sable looked at her steadily. "So would I." The silence was the kind that people use to apply pressure. She was familiar with it. She waited it out. "There are those on the council," the eldest elder said, "who believe the response indicates a bond connection between you and the Alpha King." Sable was quiet for a moment. "And if it does," she said. "Then it would need to be formally addressed," Veth said. "Named or dissolved. An unnamed bond is a political liability for Ironhold. The Alpha King has been in negotiations with the Greyfall Pack for a formal alliance match. A bond connection with an unaffiliated traveling healer would complicate those negotiations significantly." Sable looked at the Pups, who were sleeping in their pile, unbothered by the politics of the room they were in. She thought about that. "I see," she said. "We're not asking you to leave," Veth said, which meant they were. "We're asking you to consider the implications of your presence here." "I'm here to treat 6 pups who would have died in a burning forest," Sable said. "I'll be finished with that in 2 days. After that I'll leave, and whatever the council needs to do about its political negotiations, you can do without me in the room." She turned back to the pups. "I'll need the workroom until then," she said, "if that's all." It was not all. She could feel it in the way the council stood behind her, the particular weight of people who had more to say and were deciding whether the moment warranted saying it. Then Veth said, "Of course," in a voice that was smooth and careful and meant something else entirely, and the council left. Sable stood with her hands flat on the table and counted the pups. 6, still 6. Calum came to the workroom that afternoon. He came alone, which she noticed, and he closed the door behind him, which she also noticed. He stood for a moment looking at the pups, and then he looked at her, and his expression was the particular flatness of a man who has been having a conversation with himself all day and has not enjoyed it. "The council spoke to you?" he said. "Yes." "What did they say?" She told him. Plainly, without editorial, the way she reported medical findings. "Here are the facts. Here is what they suggest. Here is what I don't know." He listened without interrupting, which she'd noticed was a habit of his, and when she finished, the silence stretched long enough that she counted it. 7 seconds. "The Greyfall match," he said finally, "has been in negotiation for 2 years." "That's a long time," she said. "Yes." She waited. "It's a political arrangement," he said. "Not a bond. The council wants an alliance. The Alpha of Greyfall wants a formal connection to Ironhold's territory. I want—" He stopped. She looked at him. "What do you want?" she said. He looked at her with those gray eyes, and something in them went very quiet. Not cold. Quiet. The way a room goes quiet when someone has finally said the thing that was in it all along. "I don't know what I want," he said. "I haven't permitted myself to want anything in 4 years." She held that for a moment. "What happened 4 years ago?" she said. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "My mate left," he said. "She chose another territory, another king. She said Ironhold was too cold." He paused. She wasn't wrong about the cold. Sable looked at him, at the set of his jaw, the stillness of his hands, the particular way a man stands when he's reciting something he's made himself stop feeling. "And since then," she said, "you've been running a kingdom and negotiating political alliances and standing in the inner yard at midnight in your shirt sleeves." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. The shape of one, maybe. "Yes," he said. "That sounds exhausting," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "It is." The council called a formal hearing the next morning. Sable was informed of this by Dara, who delivered the information with the particular careful neutrality of someone who had opinions about it and was choosing not to share them. The hearing would be held in the Great Hall at midday. Her presence was requested. The word requested was doing significant work in that sentence. She went. The Great Hall was the kind of room that had been built to make people feel small, with vaulted stone ceilings and iron fixtures, and a long table at the far end where the council sat in a row. The pack was there. Not all of them, but enough. Standing along the walls in the particular stillness of people waiting to see what happens next. Kailum was at the head of the table. He looked at her when she came in. His face was the flat, controlled surface she'd seen in the courtyard on the first morning, and she understood now what it cost him to hold that surface, which was different from not understanding it. Counselor Veth stood. "We've called this hearing to address the matter of the bond response observed in the courtyard 2 days ago, specifically to determine whether a bond connection exists between Alpha King Calum of Ironhold and the traveling healer known as Sable, and if so, what action the pack requires." Sable stood in the center of the hall and looked at the council and thought about what she was going to say. The pack response was observed by multiple witnesses. Beth continued. The wolves in the courtyard bowed at her arrival. This is a recognized indicator of a mate-bond connection in Ironhold pack law. The Alpha King has not formally addressed or denied the connection. We are asking him to do so now. The hall was very quiet. Veth looked at Calum. My lord, do you acknowledge a bond connection with this woman? Calum was quiet for a long moment. His hands were flat on the table. She watched them. Then he stood. Yes, he said. The hall shifted. Not loudly, a collective exhale, the sound of a room recalibrating. The bond is real, he said. I recognized it the moment I saw her in the clearing. Before that, if I'm honest, I felt it on the road, 2 miles out, and I thought I was wrong. He paused. I wasn't wrong. Veth said carefully, the Greyfall negotiations will need to be renegotiated, he said, or ended. That's a conversation for another day. The pack law requires... I know what the pack law requires. His voice was flat and final. No explanation offered, none needed. I'm telling you what is. The bond exists. I'm not dissolving it. Sable looked at him across the hall. He looked back at her, and his expression was the particular stillness of a man who has just said the most honest thing he's said in 4 years, and is waiting to see what it costs him. She said, I haven't agreed to anything yet. The hall went very quiet again. Calum looked at her. Something in his eyes went careful. No, he said, you haven't. I'm a traveling healer, she said. I don't belong to any pack. I have patients in 3 territories and a route I've been running for 15 years. I'm not going to stand in a great hall and have a bond declared over me like a land title while the council decides what's politically convenient. Veth opened her mouth. I'm also, Sable said, not walking away from something real because it complicates your negotiations with Greyfall. So, she looked at Calum. I'd like to have a conversation, not in front of the council, not in front of the pack, a conversation. The silence stretched. Calum said, all right. He said it the way he said most things, flat, weighed, as if each word had been picked up and examined before being set down. But underneath it, very quietly, was something that sounded like relief. They walked the inner yard. It was late afternoon, and the light was the low gold of autumn, and the frost was coming up from the ground in the places where the sun hadn't reached. Sable walked with her hands in her coat pockets, and Calum walked beside her. And they were quiet for a long time before either of them spoke. The Greyfall match, she said finally. It's a political arrangement, he said. I told you that. You did. I want to know if there's a person in it, someone who's expecting something. He was quiet for a moment. The Alpha of Greyfall has a daughter. She's 23. She knows it's an alliance arrangement. She's not... He paused. She's not waiting for something that isn't coming. You've met her. 3 times, at formal negotiations. She's competent and politically skilled, and she has no more interest in a cold king at the edge of the high pine country than I have in a political arrangement. He paused. She told me so, at the last meeting, in those words. Sable looked at him sideways. I like her. Something shifted in his expression. That fraction. She was getting better at reading the variations. She would like you, he said. They walked. Your mate, she said. 4 years ago. Yes. You said she left. Were you bonded, formally? We were in the process of the formal naming when she left. The bond was incomplete. It decayed. He paused. It doesn't feel the way it sounds. The decay. It's not like something going away. It's more like a sound you've been hearing for so long you stopped noticing it, and then it stops, and the silence is the loudest thing you've ever heard. Sable was quiet. I didn't name anything after that, he said. I didn't permit myself to recognize anything. I thought... He stopped, tried again. I thought if I didn't name it, it couldn't leave. She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to look at her, and his face was the open, unguarded version of itself that she'd been catching in fragments since the clearing. In the library, in the workroom, in the 3 seconds at the arrow slit. That's not how it works, she said quietly. No, he said. I know that now. You felt the bond on the road, 2 miles out, and you came to the clearing, and you saw me kneeling in the frost with 6 pups and a traveling kit, and you... I knew, he said, immediately, the way you know things that your body understood before your mind caught up. She looked at him for a long moment. I don't know what I want, she said. I told you I'd stay 3 days. I've been here 4. My patients in the southern settlements are waiting. I have a route. I have a practice. I've built a life that doesn't... She stopped. That doesn't have room for a cold keep at the edge of the high pine country. I know, he said, but I also, she said, felt something in that courtyard when the wolves bowed. I didn't know what it was. I filed it away because I didn't have a category for it. He waited. I'm telling you, she said, that I need more than a declaration in a great hall. I need more than pack law and political inconvenience and a man who's been standing in the cold for 4 years because he's afraid to name things. What do you need? He said. She looked at him, at the gray eyes and the open hands and the stillness that was no longer the stillness of suppression, but something else. The stillness of a man who has stopped performing and is simply standing. I need you to keep naming things, she said. Not in the great hall, not for the council, for me. He held her gaze for a long moment. I can do that, he said. Starting now, she said. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had weight and intention. I've been watching you since the clearing, he said. The way you work, the way you talk to the pups, the way you stood in front of the council this morning and said exactly what was true without performing any of it. He paused. I haven't watched anyone like that in 4 years. I haven't wanted to. She held that. I don't know what your life looks like with room in it, he said. I don't know if Ironhold is something you could build toward or something you'd run from by spring. I don't know how to offer you something I've spent 4 years not offering anyone. He paused. But I know the bond is real. And I know that when I came to the clearing at dawn and found you kneeling in the frost with 6 pups you'd pulled from a burning forest, something in me... He stopped, tried again. Something stopped bracing. The frost was coming up around their feet. The low gold light was going amber. Sable looked at him for a long time. The road to Ashgate will clear in a week, she said. Maybe 2 if the rains come back. Yes, he said. My patients can wait a week. He was very still. I'm not agreeing to a bond naming, she said. I'm not agreeing to anything that gets declared in a great hall before I've decided what I want, but I'm willing to stay a week and talk and see what the keep looks like when it isn't on fire. Something moved in his face. Not the fraction. More than the fraction. All right, he said. And I want access to the library, she said. Unrestricted. You have it. And the border accords. I want to read all of them, not just the Ironhold Valdrin. There are 14 volumes. I know. I counted the shelf. He looked at her. The shape of a smile again, closer this time. All right, he said. 14 volumes. The week passed, the way good weeks do, in the particular texture of ordinary days that are not ordinary at all. She checked the pups every morning. The burns healed cleanly, and on the 5th day she removed the stitches from the shoulder laceration, while the pup sat with the suspicious dignity of someone who had decided stoicism was a personality trait. She read in the library in the afternoons, working through the border accords with the methodical pleasure of someone finally getting access to a thing they'd needed for a long time. She ate in the great hall with the pack, which was loud and specific and full of the kind of detail that made a place feel inhabited rather than occupied. Kylam ate at the head of the table and watched her from the distance of 14 feet with the particular quality of attention she was learning to recognize as his version of openness. He came to the library twice. He walked the inner yard with her once more, in the early morning when the frost was still hard and the air smelled of cold pine. He named things. Small things at first. The history of the keep, the names of the wolves in the outer yard, the reason the east tower's window was bricked over on the 3rd floor, then larger things. The border dispute with Valdrin, which was more complicated than the accords suggested. The pack members he'd lost in the last winter's illness. The way the keep felt different in spring, when the pines came back. She named things back. Her father's practice, which she'd inherited at 22. The route she'd built over 15 years. The particular loneliness of being competent in a world that treated competence as a reason not to worry about you. On the 6th day, he said, "I want to formally name the bond." She was in the library. She set down the volume she was reading. "I know," she said. "Not for the council," he said. "Not for the Greyfall negotiations or the pack law or the political implications. For me. Because I've spent 4 years not naming things, and I don't want to do that anymore." She looked at him. "I'm also," she said, "aware that a bond naming is permanent, that it's not something you undo because the road to Ashgate clears." "Yes. And you're asking me to make a permanent decision in a week." "I'm asking you to consider it," he said. "The timing is yours. I'm not—" He paused. "I'm not commanding. I'm not claiming. I'm asking." She held that distinction. It mattered, the distinction. "I need 2 more days," she said. "All right," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You said you felt the bond on the road, 2 miles out." "Yes." "How long before you knew it was real? Not just felt it, but knew?" He was quiet for a moment. "When you looked up from the pup you were treating and told me the exact medical status of 6 injured animals in the frost at dawn without any preamble or deference," he said. "That was when I knew." She looked at him. "That's very specific," she said. "You asked," he said. On the 8th day, she told him yes. She told him in the library in the afternoon, with 14 volumes of border accords on the table between them and a pup asleep on the corner of her cloak. She said it plainly, without ceremony, the way she said most true things. "Yes," she said, "I want to name it." He was very still. "I'm not giving up my practice," she said. "I'm not giving up my route. I'll need to be away from the keep for weeks at a time, sometimes longer. That's not negotiable." "I know," he said. "The keep will need to be less cold," she said. "Not the temperature, the way it holds itself. I've been watching it for 8 days, and it holds itself like it's bracing for something." He looked at her. "I know." "That's going to take time." "I know that too." She looked at him across the table, at the gray eyes and the open hands and the 14 volumes of border accords between them, which somehow felt like the most honest context she could have chosen. "All right," she said. He said quietly, "All right." The ceremony was held in the inner courtyard at dusk, with the pack gathered in the kind of deliberate attendance that meant everyone had been told and everyone had come. The frost was on the ground, and the iron torch brackets were lit, and the keep's walls caught the firelight and held it. Sable stood in the center of the courtyard in her traveling coat, which she had not exchanged for anything more ceremonial, because it was hers, and it had been through the burning forest with her, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Kylam stood across from her, and the pack's eldest elder stood between them, and the ceremony was conducted in the old pack dialect, which she didn't fully know. Kylam translated it for her, quietly, as it was spoken, each phrase in her ear in his flat and measured voice. The wolves came when the elder spoke the final line. They came from the inner gates and the outer yard and the corridor openings, and they moved into the courtyard, and they bowed. The same ripple she'd seen on the first morning, moving outward from where she stood, heads lowering in a wave that was slow and deliberate and unmistakably intentional. Not instinct this time. Recognition. The pack choosing to name what the bond had already made true. Counselor Veth was at the edge of the courtyard. Her face was careful and smooth and said nothing. Kylam looked at Sable. "The pack names you," the elder said, in the common tongue, for her benefit. "Sable of Ironhold, mate bonded and witnessed." She held it for a moment. The weight of being named somewhere, the specific gravity of belonging. Then she looked at Kylam and said quietly, "You translated the third phrase wrong." He blinked. "What?" "The third phrase. You said recognized by the territory. It's claimed by the territory. There's a difference." He stared at her. "I've been reading the pack law manuscripts," she said. 14 volumes, remember? Something broke open in his expression. Not the fraction, not the shape. The actual thing. A smile, real and unguarded, the kind she suspected he hadn't used in 4 years. "Claimed by the territory," he said. "You're right." "I usually am," she said. The pack was watching. The elder was watching. The wolves were still bowing. Kylam reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just took it and held it, the way you hold something you've decided to keep. "Claimed by the territory," he said again, quietly. "Better," she said. Later, when the ceremony was done and the pack had dispersed to the great hall for the celebration that Dara had apparently been planning for 3 days without telling anyone, Sable sat on the stone bench at the inner yard's edge with a cup of something warm and watched the torches burn. Kylam sat beside her. "The pups will be ready to go to the nursing female's den full-time tomorrow," she said. "I know." "The burns are fully healed, the stitches held cleanly." "I know. You don't need me in the workroom anymore." "No," he said. "I don't need you in the workroom." She looked at him sideways. "When does the road to Ashgate clear?" he said. 10 days, probably, maybe 2 weeks. "And you'll go?" "For 3 weeks. I have patients waiting." She paused. "And then I'll come back." He was quiet for a moment. "And then you'll come back." "That's how it works," she said. "I go, I come back. The keep is still here. You're still here." He looked at the torches. "I'll be here." She leaned back against the stone wall and looked up at the sky, which was the deep blue-black of early winter with the first stars coming through. The keep's walls were warm with firelight from the great hall windows, and the frost was on the ground. And somewhere in the inner yard, a wolf was making the low, settled sound of something at rest. "Kylam," she said. "Yes." "When you felt the bond on the road, 2 miles out." "Yes." "What did you think it was before you let yourself know?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I thought it was the cold," he said. "I thought it was the particular way the high pine country feels at dawn in autumn. I've ridden that road 100 times, and it always—" He paused. "It always feels like something is about to happen." She considered that. "And then you came to the clearing?" she said. "And then I came to the clearing," he said, "and you were kneeling in the frost with 6 pups, and your hands pressed against a wound, and the fire was behind you, and you looked up at me and gave me a medical report. And something stopped bracing, she said. Something stopped bracing, he said. The silence was the good kind, the kind that didn't need filling. She drank her warm drink. He sat beside her with his hands open on his knees, and the torches burned, and the frost crept up from the ground, and the keep held them both in its stone walls, like something that had been waiting a long time to be used for this. Pack, that's where we leave them. Sable in the frost with a warm drink and 14 volumes of border accords she's already read. Kylum with his hands open and his face unguarded for the first time in 4 years. 6 pups in a warm den, healed and sleeping. And a keep that's just a little less cold than it was a week ago. Here's what I want to know. When Sable said she needed him to keep naming things, not in the Great Hall, not for the council, but for her, was that the bravest thing she did in this story? Braver than running into the burning forest? I think it might have been. Tell me in the comments which moment got you. The clearing at dawn, the library, the council hall, or that last scene in the courtyard with the smile he hadn't used in 4 years. And if you know someone who needs a slow burn story about a woman who runs into fire and a man who finally stops running away from it, send this one to them. That's where we leave them.